At this time, I'm going to ask Carrie and Liz, they're going to pass around some information to you. And when you get the information, this will give you some numbers. The first page, you'll see the current impact fees. Then you're going to see the proposed impact fees. And the bottom line, you're going to see how it extrapolates if you're building a 1,500 to 2,499 square foot home. The second page will be the current impact fees off the Lake County impact fee for residential and commercial. Then you're going to see the impact fee map so you understand what zones are affected in the impact fees. And then you're going to see a nice article that explains the new law that was implemented last year that was supposed to protect builders and folks who were building against excessive impact fee abuse. Before I introduce our guest speaker, there's a couple of things I'd like to make an observation if I could have some forbearance. I've been to both Lake County impact fee workshops. Unfortunately, they were scheduled in such a way and publicized in such a way, in my view, that a lot of builders in our community had no knowledge they were doing it. And the purpose of these workshops were to introduce a new impact fee study, but it was also to skirt the requirements of the law. Under the new law that was signed by Governor DeSantis last year, a county or a municipality could not raise impact fees at whatever level. It was capped to 50% above the current level and only could be 12.5% per year, and it was a maximum of 1 or 2 increases. And there's other stipulations, and Commissioner Blake will get into it. They did these workshops in such a manner so that they now satisfy that requirement. And by satisfying that requirement, they are now able to fully increase the impact fees at the maximum amount allowed by study. And Commissioner Blake will come in. They are proposing to increase the impact fee rates a little less to try to prevent some lawsuits. They're also proposing special carve-outs and other things in different districts. And the most flawed part of this study is they address the proposed impact fees on residential housing, but they have zero impact fees for commercial. So you've done a study, you extrapolated these impact fees, but one of the biggest components in roads is commercial. But if you extrapolate what they're wanting to do in housing, it's a huge number. Jeremy, do you mind if I recognize you? Please stand up. This is Jeremy Hoff from the Hoff Company. He's the president of the Home Builders Association of Lake Sumter. We're so glad to have you here, Jeremy. So I sort of want to set this up a little bit for Commissioner Blake because, first off, I think the process has been ingenuous. The study is totally flawed because it makes an argument that impact fees are supposed to be to build all the new roads. Well, let me explain something. The county gets road funding from federal government, state government. They get it from the local MPO. There's all kind of funding for roads. But most importantly, the failure of this county has been for the last 20 years, they've used no general funds, to pay for roads. In other words, they haven't invested in roads. The biggest thing about impact fees that get me is there's several things that this commission believes. They believe that all you rich builders pay for impact fees. That is as nonsensical as Don Magruder at Romac Building Supply saying that all you builders pay for my lumber and building material supplies and you don't pass it along to your customers. Everything goes to the end user. The other thing that they try to paint is this picture that impact fees only affect the rich. There's massive impact fees on rental housing. And this is going to greatly impact the price of rental housing. The other thing they don't get is that we're in a housing crisis. There's a fundamental shortage of housing, and even worse, a fundamental shortage of affordable housing. They don't get that. And the other thing that this commission I find nonsensical is if you would look at each one of their social media posts, most of them talk about Washington, D.C., and they talk about the Biden administration, and they talk about the taxation and the inflation. Yet their policies local regarding impact fees, environmental issues, the lack of privacy in land and ownership in land, mirrors that of anyone from a New York liberal district. In fact, maybe even worse. Yet they have the audacity to call themselves a conservative Republican. I will tell you one thing, and I will say it with him sitting here. The only conservative Republican on the Lake County Commission is Commissioner Josh Blake. He stood strong and he told the story about how, basically what I said, how these fees were unfair, how they were a tax. A fee is a tax. A fee is a tax. No other way of saying it. Commissioner Blake stood strong. He was the only dissenting vote, hard dissenting vote, proposing not to increase these fees. Commissioner Blake was the only person to stand up for working people. He was the only one to stand up for people who needed affordable housing. And he's the strongest voice we have on the Lake County Commission for low taxation, and he genuinely is a conservative Republican. So Commissioner Blake has strong opinions on this. He's provided great leadership. But I'll be honest with you, if we don't get another vote, the only way, unless they get 4 out of 5 of the commission voters, and Commissioner Blake will go into that in more detail, they can put it at whatever number. They call this a special circumstance. The law allows a special circumstance, like emergency. What's happening in North Myers Beach and Sanibel Island is emergency. 20 years of poor budget work in Lake County is not emergency. It's not emergency. Plus the other thing that people miss about Lake County, and we have some commissioners from Leesburg who will tell you, every year Lake County shrinks geographically. So someone needs to explain to me if Lake County is shrinking geographically because of annexations from city, why does their budget continue to rise? So Commissioner Blake, we're very proud to have you here. We're thankful for your voice, your conservative voice, and you need to just tell us what we need to do to help you. Let me present Commissioner Blake.
Sir. Well, thank you, Don, and thanks for having me here. I don't know if I need to use this one. I have this one on. To your point, Mr. Magruder, the day that the second workshop day, the 4 people that showed up, one of the problems I've had with this whole process is that the stakeholders, and I consider the home builders and contractors to be the most important stakeholders in this discussion, were not even aware that this was going on. I mean, I had to call Lisa and tell her, I said, did you know that they're proposing one of the biggest increases, I think the biggest impact fee increase in the history of Lake County? Nobody knew. And I think that was probably by design, not to slam anybody. But to Don's point, the day that this was approved to be advertised and to have our county attorney draft the ordinances, 4 people showed up to support it. And Don and maybe one other showed up to oppose it. The 4 people who showed up, I happen to know them all. 3 of them are recent evacuees from New York, and 1 is from California. Not a single person who's from a red state, who would understand the attraction of the red state sort of ethos, stood up to support these. And I found that very telling. And you see the bumper stickers, "Don't New York my Florida." That's all I could think about. And I think I said that at the meeting. I said, this is New Yorking Florida. When you're comparing us to Orange County to justify a massive tax increase. And it would be a dumb idea, I think, on a good day. But on the cusp of a recession, it's just insulting, in my opinion. So I just thought I'd go through some of the stuff that Don mentioned here. As he mentioned, impact fees, they can't be spent. Like they're trying to make this argument, we have to catch up on our roads and so forth. Impact fees can only be spent, no matter what the category is, transportation, libraries, whatever, can only be spent to increase capacity. You can't build a new road or you can widen a road, you can put a new turn lane. The impact fees are very specific. They can only be spent to increase capacity. And in Lake County's case, I don't recall exactly, it was before my time when they instituted impact fees, but there used to be 3 districts. There was a north, a central, and a south district. Leesburg, I think, has probably always been in the central district, just geographically. The money that is raised in that district has to be spent in that district. So in other words, if you have some mega development happening in South Lake County and they're collecting, which they collect the most impact fees, all that money has to be spent on increasing, in the case of a transportation fee, transportation impacts in that area. So about 3 or 4 years ago, we added a 4th district, and that was the Wekiva area up there. And the commission, this was before the current board, but the last board, carved it up a little bit differently, and there were different fees based on different areas. And the argument they made at the time was that, well, we don't have a whole lot of growth in the central district and up in the northeast district, up in the forest, so we're not going to charge impact fees because, to be honest with you, some people view hiking the impact fee, maybe most people, I don't know, as a way to discourage growth. It's not even necessarily to keep up and make so-and-so pay their fair share, which, just quick poll to his point, how many people in this room think that the impact fee is borne solely by the contractors and the builders and it's not passed on to the buyers? Anybody think that? I tell you, I'm the only one who doesn't think that on the board. Everybody thinks that's the case. And they made the argument that day that, well, this is just the developers, they pay this fee and they can absorb it and stuff. Regardless, even if that were true, you're expropriating money from the private sector, sucking it into the public sector black hole in the middle of a recession, which is a terrible idea. But I don't believe that's the case. And not only do I not believe that's the case, in the case of single-family homes, home builders, that money doesn't get paid up front. It gets rolled into the mortgage when somebody buys the house. And so that whatever $15,000 worth of impact fees gets paid over 30 years, and it's a lot more than $15,000 by the time it's all said and done. So these are things you have to think about and what that does to the economy and money that it sucks out. So in any case, this last meeting, and I will point this out, I'm not cynical, but I will point out that this only came on the agenda immediately after there were no further elections to be discussed on the Lake County Commission. Some people were elected without opposition, and all of a sudden this was a priority. I don't think this would have come up at all if there were still an election to be had. So it came up, and Central District, I'll just give you one example. I'm District 5 on the County Commission as of redistricting, so I have Lady Lake, Fruitland Park, Leesburg, the 27 corridor there. I used to have the Ocala Forest and all the way up to Volusia and Marion County. The impact fee, just as an example, for transportation for that district, the Central District, is less than $1,000 for the transportation only, like $956. The proposed amount that they want to raise it to is almost $5,000 for that category alone. Almost a 400% increase just in the transportation fee for the Central District. Now, one development that came about during the 2 workshops that we had was that the Villages is a part of that Central District. Of course, they've already committed all these resources and stuff, and they're having some development in conjunction with Leesburg. They are carving out a different district for the Villages because of the internal traffic capture, which will, I assume, probably remain the same. Which is good, but it's not good that that courtesy isn't being extended to everyone else in the county. I think that needs to be extended to everybody. I think that the argument that you need to raise taxes and pull more money out of the private sector during a recession is ridiculous. And I've made this point before. When the county commission says, well, we need more money in reserves, this is going to the ad valorem tax, really. We need to beef up our reserves. What if we have a hurricane? Everything that benefits county reserves occurs to the detriment of taxpayer reserves. It's a zero-sum game. That money, you know what I mean? That we don't print money in Lake County. It comes from taxpayers. And so everything that comes in that provides a healthy buffer for the public sector does so at the detriment of the private sector. So another reason to, at a minimum, not do this right now. Don talked a little bit about the legislation that was signed by the governor last year. I'll give you some background on that. Do you remember what happened after the elections in 2020? Sumter County swept in 3 new county commissioners who had run against an ad valorem tax hike, and what they immediately did was raised their transportation impact fee by the most I think it had ever been raised, and I can't recall exactly what the percentage was. As a reaction to that, the legislature passed House Bill 377. And this was to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And what House Bill 377 did was it limited how much you could hike. You could not have these extraordinary impact fee hikes if a commission came in and just went nuts. But you could do as much as 50% increase, which is a lot. But the legislature then stipulated that it must be phased in over a 4-year period, 12.5% a year. So it's not some sort of big shock to the system, to the economy, or to, in this case, our industry. And so, but in that bill, the legislature included an accidental kill switch, which was that unless it's in extraordinary circumstances. And I totally agree that what happened in Fort Myers is an extraordinary circumstance, and if you had to do some temporary thing to get the roads rebuilt there, that's one thing. We are not experiencing extraordinary circumstances in Lake County. If anything, the opposite is true. The opposite is true, that we need to do whatever we can to keep money in people's pockets as we head into a global economic, hopefully not, but a disaster. And so the extraordinary circumstances, when we had that presentation from county staff, and I'm not slamming county staff has to do what 3 out of 5 of the county commissioners asked them to do. So that's not their fault. But libraries was mentioned, extraordinary circumstances with libraries, extraordinary circumstances with firehouses. We've already budgeted money for all of these various things. We give $1.5 million a year roughly, for example, for new vehicles for the sheriff. $1 million that gets saved up and then spent on new firehouses as those become available. There's money in the infrastructure sales tax budget, that's how that was sold, to pay for all of these things. There is not a situation in Lake County that justifies using the kill switch in that legislation that was designed to protect people from these outrageous government increases. And I'll tell you something that's an interesting statistic that was given to us by county staff in a presentation 2 weeks ago. Excuse me. And here's the number. Every $100 increase in rent, monthly increase in rent, results in a 9% increase in homelessness. And I even went back during the questions, I said, did I write that down correctly? A $100 increase in monthly rent increases homelessness by 9%? Yeah, absolutely. So if there were ever another reason, as Mr. Magruder has mentioned, and I've mentioned since I've been on the board, the housing crisis is largely, I mean, it's not completely, but largely a government-created crisis. I distributed an article that was in Reason magazine called How the War on Urban Sprawl Created the Housing Crisis. And it was specifically talking about the Pacific Northwest, suburban Portland, some of those areas that have tried these different strategies and failed and just made their housing crisis worse. But if that's true, and if $100 in rent contributes that to the homelessness crisis, we are in big trouble, because the combination of us not adopting the rollback rate, which happened last week, and increasing impact fees up to 95%. And to explain that to you, so the cap, if the board were to adopt the 50% increase that's phased over 4 years, that's the statutory, that's House Bill 377. They could do that and people would know what to plan on. I still disagree with it, but it would be 12.5% over 4 years. In order for them to go to 95% of the calculated rate, and all that means is that the county every so often hires a consulting firm that then goes through and calculates what they think development's fair share is on these different categories. That's what it is. In our case, the firm was, I think, Banesh. So they come up with this number, and then you're legally justified to charge 100% of what that number they come up with is. Now, the reason that we don't charge 100%, and the reason that the board is now saying they want to charge 95% of the calculated rate, is because if somebody were to do another study and come back and show that, oh, you're actually charging 5% more than the real calculated rate, well, then you're open to legal problems. And so they give themselves a 5% buffer by taking it up to 95% of the calculated rate that they could charge. In order for them to do that and to see the increases that have been distributed to you, and I have some up here from the county, it's like a one-pager, if anybody would like a copy of that. In order for that to happen, they have to have a supermajority. So 4 votes. I'm obviously a no vote. So our goal here in having this conversation today, in trying to make as many of the stakeholders, the actual stakeholders on this subject aware of this, is so that we can peel off, hopefully convince one other member of the county commission to vote against it. That would greatly limit the damage. Even if they went with the 50% increase, it's a 4-year process. It's much easier to handle, and I'll vote against that as well. But we're just trying to stop the bleeding here, I think, as an industry and as me as a conservative, trying to stop the bleeding and make sure this doesn't go through. Because, as I mentioned before, well, county manager's calling me. I'm just gonna have to call her back. As I mentioned before, there could not be a worse time to raise impact fees, to increase the cost of doing business in Lake County, and to increase the cost of rentals in Lake County. And something I mentioned just as an aside on the impact, on the ad valorem, your millage, the property taxes, is that if you have a home and you have a homestead exemption, you're somewhat insulated from the effects of a huge property value assessment change, as we've had this year, right? And Florida is like the place to be, which is great on one hand, right? But on the other hand, it's going to raise people's tax bill. And so, but if you have a homestead exemption, you're insulated from that. It's like you can't have more than 3% increase in a year. But if you own rental properties, which is for a lot of people an option that they need, that's not protected. And you have a roughly 10% increase in assessed values overall, that's also going to contribute to the cost of living and to exacerbating what is already a housing pinch. So it's just another reason that I'm somewhat shocked to be in the situation where we have to have these conversations, because we saw firsthand that people and corporations do respond to economic incentives. And if you create a disincentive for someone, they will go elsewhere. And that's why we have that hospital. So for me, using that as an example, is just another reason that we don't want to get that reputation. We don't want to get that reputation. And by the way, two of the Sumter County commissioners who voted for that are no longer with us. They got removed by the governor. So again, I talked about the extraordinary circumstances. I would welcome anybody who wants to see what those extraordinary circumstances are. I can email that PowerPoint presentation to Mr. Magruder and have that distributed. There's nothing extraordinary about it. There's nothing extraordinary about it. It is an excuse. It's an excuse to raise impact fees. I think that perhaps they saw that there was some development coming in, and I understand the human impulse is to not just be happy with the golden eggs, but to try to get the goose as well. And I think that's essentially what's going on. They thought that they could capture a lot more revenue this way. I personally, going back to my previous example, would rather have bad roads than a 10% increase in homelessness in Lake County. My previous job, before I got elected in 2016, I worked for 8 years for the Florida legislature as a legislative aide in the House of Representatives. And during our first housing crisis, or the Great Recession, you would not believe how many families were forced to move into the Ocala forest and live in tents. You think I'm exaggerating, but there were ministries that popped up to help service these people. We were a drop-off point for coats and food, and somebody would come in every week and take this stuff up to the Ocala forest for the people who couldn't afford a place to rent or a home to own. So there are very real-world consequences to allowing this kind of thing to happen, because it does create this really bad spiral, this vortex that is really hard to pull out of once you've allowed it to begin. And so, again, I appreciate the chance to come. I hope I've done a good job. If anybody has any questions of what this means, yes, sir.
In your opinion, who's the best commissioner that we should start to go after?
Yeah, so I hate to name names, but I think Commissioner Kirby Smith is in the real estate business. I think he's probably likely to be a sympathetic ear. And you know, the thing that I've talked to Don about is that this is up in the air. For them to do the full 95%, which is the example of the 400% increase in the transportation fee for a single family home in my district, this area, that requires 4 votes. They can do the 50% with a majority. They just need 3 people. But again, I think that's probably best case scenario for us. It's the lesser of 2 evils.
I'd like to reiterate at 2:30, right, Lisa? 2 o'clock at the home builder's office in Tavares. Kirby Smith and the county manager will be meeting with home builders over there. And I know you cannot comment on it, but I can comment as someone observing the workshop. Kirby was having heartburn with this. Commissioner Smith was having heartburn with this, wanting to go full amount. He understands what's at play here. You know, the one thing about impact fees that is always missed. You know, every builder in this room knows, you buy a lot for $30,000. A vacant lot to the city, to Lake County is worth very minimal in ad valorem taxes, property taxes. As soon as you put a house on it, that value and your taxes go up 10 to 15%. That's the reason why most jurisdictions in America have 0 impact fees. That's the reason why most jurisdictions in America want housing growth, because it raises property taxes. And the other thing that's being missed totally, and I don't want to escape, we're talking about home builders, but if you're a commercial builder, they're wanting to dramatically increase commercial impact fees, and that will be a jobs and business killer. And if you want to see what lowering commercial impact fees will do for you, go up to Ocala. The Ocala's impact fees are dramatically lower. Sumter counties are dramatically lower. You know, here's the other thing. We're already 9 to 10 times more impact fees than Sumter and Marion County right now before this increase. And they want to add more to it. Can you explain why they would want to add more to it?
Absolutely. Well, listen, we get compared to Marion County all the time for other budget reasons. If it's like, oh, well, look what they fund their sheriff's budget at, we need to do that. Comparisons. When it comes to this, crickets, because you're right. They have very minimal impact fees in Marion County, and they're sort of the example in economic development. I mean, we're now sort of modeling our economic development after the Marion County model quite recently. So it's kind of funny. It's one of those things they don't want to talk about, but absolutely, you're artificially suppressing supply. It's the government artificially suppressing supply. What that does in the real estate market, housing, is it increases demand, increases the values, increases your taxes. Increased property taxes is only good for you if you're leaving, if you're selling, right? Otherwise, you're just paying more. So,
Josh, the other thing is, how does this become an ordinance? First off, I was told by county staff, I'm sorry I couldn't provide you a detailed, more information. I was told by your county staff that they would put it on the website.
yeah.
They haven't posted a meeting, haven't posted the ordinance. The way they left these workshops, and that maybe you can hit on this, Josh,
Yeah.
they're going to allow any type of proposed ordinance to be drafted. And then they're just going to pick and choose what they want. It was sort of dishonest almost, wasn't it?
So they had the 2 workshops. That was the statutory requirement to go to the full 95% of the consultant's recommendation. I talked to the county manager yesterday about this. This is not going to be before us to review those ordinances until either the last meeting in October or the first meeting in November. So they're still being drafted. Those ordinances are still being drafted by the county attorney's office. But absolutely, it's very vague, very ambiguous. These are just the 2 big options here. The one, as I mentioned, if the community can peel off another vote, that one goes to an early grave, and that's great. The other stuff is just all up for debate. They could on the spot change the ordinance.
Yeah, and they're talking about making different categories and adding different thises and that's.
Right.
What you think you're going to be paying for impact fees 3 months from now could be totally changed, because they're drafting the ordinances in such a way that they literally could do anything. And by having these 2 workshops, they've got carte blanche if they can get that 4th vote, correct?
Yes. But the ordinance, when it's finally voted on, will be in final form. That will be, I mean, that won't be changeable.
Yep. Are there any questions for Commissioner Blake? Yes, sir.
Is this the presentation done by the consulting company?
It looks like it, yeah. Does it say Banesh at the bottom? I think that's it, yeah.
So, when was the study done?
The study took months and months and months, maybe over a year, because I had requested it when that study was done for us to have broken down into cottage homes. I wanted a new category of 800 square feet or less because, you know, that's a big sort of national movement. So I had requested that as a new category and to see what the impact would be. But yeah, it had been done for a long time.
Oh, this was done a long time ago?
No. It took a long time for them to complete the study. Everything that's happening now is a result of that being presented to us.
Okay. I just noticed one thing, I went through this, and for the road impact fee revenue projection, it was using 2015 to 2020 average. But we all know stars went up, shot up in 2021, so it's probably the highest impact fee revenue increase. So
Yeah.
it's probably skewing the average, and they're using the lower average to project in a future year's revenue. So I think it's
That's a great point, and that's a question I asked at the last meeting. If you remember, I said, because I took some flack, said, well, what's your proposal, Blake? And I said, to use the infrastructure sales tax if you have a shortfall and like cut back on some of the like nice to have things and focus on roads, since that's like a core function of government. And then like that's cash that you have. You're not borrowing it. You're not raising anybody's taxes. Just use what you already have. And they said, well, that's not gonna pay for it. And I said, well, how much are you raising by raising everybody's taxes? Do we have an estimate on that? No. They don't even know how much, even if they were to do the 95% of the calculation, there's no fiscal impact that's been floated as an estimate for us to even know, so they're totally flying blind.
Let me ask a general question. How many in this room feel like your property taxes, some of it should be used to maintain and build roads? That's everyone. That's pretty common sense. In Lake County, they don't have that issue. George, you have a question?
A comment, and Josh and I have talked about this before, but prior to impact fees, 8% of the county budget was for roads. 8%. And also, we didn't roll any millage rates back, and the county still got a 13 or 14% increase because of the value of the homes and the new homes and all the existing homes that was in the process.
And another point is that in the previous iteration of the infrastructure sales tax, half of that money had to go to roads. When they reauthorized it, it went down to like a third for infrastructure, and roads was maybe a piece of that. So when that got reauthorized, that really hurt sort of the regular funding for roads.
And George, you make an outstanding point with the inflation we have in housing now. The inflation we have in housing. They're flush with more property taxes because that vacant piece of land, you build a new house on it today, they're getting more money than they ever have, but it's not good enough. Once again, and I'm going to say it, does this sound more like Washington, D.C.? Does that, anything we describe, does that describe any conservative Republicans other than Commissioner Blake on that commission? It's a serious matter. And I'm going to say something that Commissioner Blake's echoed. They did it while you wasn't watching. They're counting on you to be inattentive. They're counting on you not to show up. They're counting on you that since you have so much money, instead of passing those costs to your end user, you're going to just pay this $5,000, $10,000, whatever amount they pick and choose. Guys, it's one of the times you have to show up. You have to make some phone calls. You know, at some point, lawsuits may have to be filed. I mean, at some point, we have to stop this. How can you have the highest impact fees out of Marion, Sumter, and Lake County by far, and then you're wanting to add 100%? And once again, you know, they claim roads where it's an emergency, but where's their emergency in libraries? If a family's homeless, like Josh, does that library matter? So it's a big issue, and I know we're trying to rile you up and try to give you information, but guys, this is happening to you. And how much more can you stand to take? Any other questions for Commissioner Blake? Commissioner Blake, we thank you so much.
Thanks for
Once
having me.
again, he really stood up for he didn't stand up for the industry. He stood up for taxpayers. He stood up for people trying to find a decent house. He stood up for renters. He didn't stand up for the building material industry. He's what he said he is. He's a conservative Republican. And Commissioner Blake, we thank you for representing us. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
I told you we were going to be respectful of your time. We're not going to keep people for no reason. Once again, we thank you so much for joining us today. We try to have a Builders Box lunch every quarter to keep you informed on the economy and other issues. You're always welcome. And once again, we thank the Home Builders Association of Lake Sumter, Lisa and Jeremy. Please, if you can go visit them today at 2 o'clock today and give support. If you know a commissioner, call Kirby Smith, Commissioner Smith. Call some of the other folks to let them know how dissatisfied you are with it. You can help yourself. And then when we have the meeting, Lisa's group and Romac News, if you're not signed up for our Romac News, you can see Carrie in the back. We will notify you when the meeting is at, but I do encourage you to show up. But once again, we're respectful of your time. Thank you so much for being here today. Have a great rest of your day.
From foundation to rooftop, Romance got you covered.